Pfizer says they will have results in October, and the president has said that there could be a vaccine approved before the election. What's the most realistic time frame for approval?
Well, I have said now multiple times over the last several months that the projection would be that by the end of November, December of this calendar year, that we would have an answer whether or not we have a safe and effective vaccine that's approvable. Is it possible that it could be before then? And the answer is yes. I think it's unlikely, but I think it's possible. And the possibility will be dictated by, for example, if you have the trial being taken place in an area that happens to have a lot of infections, you may get an answer sooner than you would have projected, because the answer is event-driven. It's not driven by the time of the trial or by the number of people in the trial. It's driven by the number of events or infections, as it were, that you have in the placebo group versus the experimental group. So again, my prediction is going to be November, December, but I would not be overly surprised if it happened before then.
That's approval. What about actual rollout of a vaccine?
Good point.
People getting it.
Good point. Right now, there are mechanisms in place to make doses of vaccines even before we know whether it works or not. And there are pre-orders and pre-purchases of vaccines on the part of the federal government. The way it looks like it'll play out, by the time we get to the end of the year, we will have a few to 10 millions of doses. We won't have hundreds of millions of doses. As we get into 2021, the beginning first quarter and half of the year, then you're talking about several tens, if not hundreds of millions of doses.
There's a surge of cases in the Midwest, colleges. This is something obviously everybody's concerned about. What should colleges be doing? Should they be sending students home?
No.
More testing? What should colleges be doing?
Well, colleges are doing different models. Some colleges are doing everything virtual and online, but that's not what many of the colleges are doing. Many of them are testing everybody before they even get on into the dorms, into the campus, and then doing surveillance intermittently. Sometimes that's a couple of times a week, sometimes that's a little bit more. But the important thing is to have the capability when a student gets infected, rather than close everything down or sending them home, to have either a dorm or a floor of a dorm where they could safely and comfortably segregate them from the rest of the students. But we are not recommending that they send an infected college student home, because what you're then doing is you're getting an infected person and putting them back in the community to spread infection. So the best thing you can do is to keep them on campus, segregated from the rest of the students, but not essentially telling them to go home.
The number of African-American medical students now is about the same as it was decades ago, especially men. How do you solve this problem, and how big a problem do you see that as?
Oh, it is a big problem. We've got to get more minority students into medical school and nursing schools, but certainly mostly medical schools. You want the medical staff throughout the country to reflect as much as possible what the demography of the country is. And we absolutely need more minority, particularly African-American medical students and ultimately physicians.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.